Hello, my beautiful soul tribe. I hope you're having a wonderful day. Today, I would like to share with you something that I don't like to talk about very much for various reasons, but I do realize that in speaking about this from my own perspective, I hope that I can show you that it's actually very healing to share parts of your life story, not from a place of victimhood, or I'm not sharing this because I'm looking for attention or sympathy. I'm not looking for anything. I'm just sharing with you my story, my experience of being a rescuer in a marriage with someone who had several addictions. The primary addiction was alcoholism. Now, as you can imagine, this was a very toxic, emotionally abusive relationship. It was debilitating for both of us and very disempowering for many different reasons for each of us. But let me go back to the beginning. When I first met this man, I realize looking back now that my own levels of self-esteem and self-worth were very, very low. And when I met him, I really put him on a pedestal and saw him as somebody who was, in my eyes, very worldly wise, dynamic, had lots of experience. He was extremely intelligent and exciting, and I fell head over heels in love with this person. And as I got to know him a bit better, he started revealing his history, his story, life story, and experiences going back to his childhood. And he'd had many painful experiences, which sadly he hadn't been able to process or come to terms with or release in any way. So each time he moved into a new relationship, he was taking those same issues with him. And sadly, when I realized how, in my eyes, broken this person was and what a painful life experience he'd had, many of the experiences were related to female figures from his past, and I was, without realizing it initially, determined that I was going to prove to him that I was a person that could be trusted, could be relied on, and someone that wouldn't let him down, that wouldn't hurt him like he had been hurt in the past, that wouldn't betray him, and that would be supportive and loving and encouraging. I wanted to be everything that I believed he had been looking for in a partner. But very quickly, the relationship began to change, and I realized that while he had a more dominant position and I became quite subservient, the more dominant he became, the more demanding he was, the less confident I felt, and the more my self-esteem seemed to diminish. And one of the things that he would do on a regular basis in order to control me, I guess, in some ways, was to humiliate me in public. He would say really unkind things, and because I just didn't know how to handle the situation, because we were in public, I absolutely detest public conflict. I find it very humiliating and embarrassing. So my defense mechanism was to pretend either that I hadn't heard what he said, or if I couldn't use that ruse, then I would pretend that it didn't affect me. Now, this was obviously a lie, but because I didn't want anybody else to realize how much his behavior and his hurtful words really did affect me, I just kept quiet. I didn't tell anybody, not even my closest family, just how bad the situation became over the years. And I've had to process a lot of what happened throughout those years. We were together for 20 years in all, married for 19 of them. And I've had to really look at my role in all of that. Obviously I could see the outward signs of the pain that he was struggling with. His escape was mainly into alcohol, which really created massive problems in our lives, particularly financial. We got into enormous debt because he was constantly trying to project an image to the world that he was financially very stable and doing extremely well and had plenty of money to throw around, so he would be constantly not even offering it. It was a demand almost to pay for other people's meals if we were out socially, constantly paying for things for other people that we just couldn't afford, until we, no matter how many times I tried to have a conversation with him about the finances and how much I was struggling, because he'd placed the responsibility for making sure all the bills were paid firmly in my lap. He refused point blank to have any conversations about it. So I just carried on struggling on my own, trying to make sure that we were okay. We were both in very good jobs, earning very good salaries, but we were living way beyond our means, and I just could not seem to get through to him that we couldn't continue like that. So I kept quiet, and I just carried the burden and hoped that somehow or other, as time went by, that the penny would drop and he would see that I wasn't judging him, I wasn't trying to change him, I was just accepting this dysfunctional situation in the hope that one day it might have changed. And yet, underneath that pretense, I really felt helpless and hopeless. I dug myself into a hole that I didn't know how to get out of. I didn't know how to approach anybody else to ask for help. My pride wouldn't allow me to. I just didn't want anyone else to realize what a mess my life was. And I eventually realized that what was behind this pride and the anguish that I was feeling was shame. I felt so much shame that I had failed at 2 previous marriages, and I was so really determined that I was going to stick at this one and I was going to make it work. Obviously, you can't make any relationship work if only one partner is putting in the effort. And sadly, he just refused to even admit or acknowledge that he had a problem. So it was really a no-win situation. So I just stuck it out. And it seems that the less I objected to his behavior, and the more I covered up and made excuses for his behavior out loud and to myself, the more license I gave him to continue with his dysfunctional, abusive behaviors. So we really were caught in this dreadfully dysfunctional, toxic cycle And I truly couldn't see a way out of it. The finances had become so complex and so dire that more than anything kept me trapped in the situation for a very long time, until it reached a crisis point where I realized the only thing I could do was approach a debt counselor and appeal to them for some sort of help and guidance. Now, as you can imagine, I did try to speak to him about this and get his consent for me to go that route, but he wouldn't even have a conversation with me. So in the end, in absolute desperation, I went ahead and did it anyway. And when I told him afterwards what I'd done, the fallout was pretty awful. And the toxic behavior and the drinking escalated. The emotionally abusive behavior escalated. And he blamed me entirely for how bad our situation was. And I'm not just talking about the finances. He blamed me for every aspect of how bad the situation had become. And because I was still in my low self-esteem, low confidence, feeling unworthy of being treated better than that, I believed him. And I started mentally beating myself up. I could feel I was sliding into depression. I still hadn't spoken to anybody else about my situation other than the debt counselor. And they came up with a plan, which I initiated, but I could see it was a plan that was going to take years for us to really turn our situation around. And in the meantime, unfortunately, the drinking and the spending and the living this false lifestyle on his part just continued. And the emotional abuse continued to get worse and worse until it started becoming more physical. And even at that moment, I still hesitated to walk away. The feeling of helplessness and hopelessness reached a point where I was seriously considering suicide. There had been times when I lay in bed at night, and I feel very sad to be able to admit this, but it's the truth of my situation. There were times that I lay in bed and I wished him dead, because it was the only way I could see out of my situation at that moment. And it's an awful thing to have to admit that the person that I cared most about in the world, it would have been easier for me had he died. Well, he didn't, thankfully. But the shame that I felt after 19 years of this behavior and feeling this helplessness to do anything to improve his self-belief, because he clearly did not care about himself either. It just left me feeling empty. I reached a point where I was up against a wall. I felt I'd tried every avenue I could to help him, to help us, to improve our situation and our relationship with one another. But I could just feel that void, the gap between us, getting wider and wider as I tried to protect myself from the increasing abuse And I could see his anger and frustration at me pulling away was also escalating and adding fuel to the fire. And so eventually, after 20 years, I finally found the courage to say, enough, I can't do this anymore. I went and spoke to my best friend first. She was the first person I'd spoken to about any of it. And she encouraged me to speak to my family, which I did. And at that point, I made the decision to walk away. I lost everything in the process. I was living in the UK at the time, and I decided that the best solution for me would be to return to South Africa, because quite honestly, I didn't feel safe enough living in the UK once I told him I wanted a divorce, because he had threatened me many times throughout our marriage that if he ever caught me with somebody, or if I ever tried to leave, that he would destroy me. And he was quite graphic and specific in how he would go about that. And I believed him. So when I eventually made that decision, I waited until the day before he was flying to America on business. I told him the night before, and the next day he told me that night when I asked him for a divorce. He, as you can imagine, was not happy at all, and basically told me I must just pack my things and get the hell out of the house, and I wasn't allowed to take anything with me. So the next morning I did. I packed my clothes and I went to my best friend's, and we came up with a plan. And because I had nothing, I had no money. I had a little bit of money, but not enough to really survive on. She was unbelievably kind and compassionate of my situation, and she bought me a ticket to fly back to South Africa. So for the next week, I basically tied up all the loose ends of my life, told the people who needed to know where I was going, and I got on a plane and left. For the next 18 months, I endured reams of abusive emails, threatening emails, being told by him that he was going to find a way to have me extradited. He would trump up reasons, accusing me of theft and whatever he could think up. He told me that he had friends who had been previous Zulu scouts in Rhodesia during the war days, which I knew to be true. And he told me that he had told them to come and look for me and that my days were numbered. So for 18 months, I spent my time looking over my shoulder in fear that his threats were going to manifest. It took me many, many years to come to terms with my part in all of that, and how there had been choice points throughout the marriage where I could have walked away, I could have ended things and maybe created a better life for myself, but I didn't. And the reason I didn't, I believe, was this shame that I felt at seeing myself as a failure and not wanting to abandon him. And yet in the end, what I realized was my rescuing disempowered both of us. It kept both of us in a painful situation, because I do believe now that before we incarnate in this life, we each decide the journey that we want to walk and the lessons that we want to learn. And we contract with certain people, other souls, part of our soul group, soul family, to play various roles. We're like actors on a stage, if you like. And we agree to take on these different roles to help one another to learn these various life lessons. And what I've come to realize is that what kept me trapped in that dysfunctional relationship was my silence, my refusal to share my shame with other people. The silence is what keeps the shame alive. It keeps it alive it did keep it alive in my mind, and it kept the toxic relationship alive. Had I spoken, had the courage to speak, and maybe to say, I deserve more than this. I deserve to be treated with respect and loving kindness. I deserve to be loved and to find someone who would accept the love that I wanted to offer. Perhaps it wouldn't have been such a long, drawn-out, painful journey. But if it was going to change in any way, I would have had to have taken that step. But my internal critic and the level of self-judgment that I was immersed in just completely shackled me in my shame. And it's only now, looking back over my lifetime, this was many years ago now, I can see the value in sharing my experience with other people. I wish I'd had the courage to do it at the time when I was in such a painful situation, but I can do it now. And I sincerely hope that by doing it now, I'm showing other people who might be in a similar dysfunctional, toxic relationship where they feel trapped in silence because of their own sense of shame, that the way out of that is having the courage to reach out. Find someone you trust that you can speak to, because that's the first step towards releasing yourself and allowing yourself to step into a more healthy way of life where you can claim your worthiness in this world. Because believe me, each one of us are worthy of being treated with loving kindness. And so I leave this with you. I would love you to look at my website. I offer various empowering healing tools, and I would love to work with anyone who feels that they may have a connection with what I've just shared. So thank you for spending this short time with me. And I wish you all blessings and love. And I look forward to sharing time with you again in the future.